The United States and Europe, we belong together. Those were the conciliatory words of the US Secretary of State Marco Rubio at the Munich Security Conference. But as welcome as his words were, did they really make any difference to what the Trump administration thinks of Europe and its leaders? Hello and welcome to Roundtable. I'm Enda Brady. Now, a year ago, US Vice President JD Vance rattled Europe with a speech that drove home just what a dim view the Trump administration holds of its leaders. This time round in Munich, the message came from Marco Rubio, Trump's Secretary of State. He said America wants to revitalize an old friendship, but there was no apology for US plans to annex Greenland or the frequent criticisms of Europe.
After months of strained relations between America and Europe, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio tried to steady the alliance at this year's Munich Security Conference.
America is charting the path for a new century of prosperity, and that once again, we want to do it together with you, our cherished allies and our oldest friends.
From the very podium where US Vice President JD Vance criticized European policies last year, Rubio struck a noticeably softer tone, earning a standing ovation. But beyond the applause, doubts remain. The Trump administration has unsettled European allies with trade measures, repeated threats to annex Greenland, and mounting pressure on defense spending. Publicly, there were handshakes and smiles. Privately, officials speak of a deeper crisis of trust. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz warned that the world's rules-based order no longer exists, and Europe can't rely so heavily on Washington.
A
true ally takes his obligations seriously. No one forced us into the excessive dependence on the United States that we found ourselves in recently. This immaturity was our own fault, but we are now leaving this situation behind us, and sooner rather than later.
In another sign of unease, Rubio skipped a key meeting on Ukraine and made little mention of the war in his speech. UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer said in his address that Europe needs to stand on its own 2 feet, while French President Emmanuel Macron argued the bloc must become a true geopolitical power. So while Rubio says the US wants to move forward together, Europe appears to be preparing for a future where it has to go it alone.
Well, let's meet our guests. I'm delighted to say, joining me in the studio, we have Natia Seskuria. She is an Associate Fellow of International Security at London's Royal United Services Institute, RUSI. Also here with me is TRT World correspondent Victoria Innes, who was reporting on the conference from Munich. And joining us from Brussels, we have Oliver Drews. He is a former EU Commission spokesman. And in Nashville, Tennessee, in the United States, we have Steve Gill, political commentator and a former advisor to Bill Clinton and George Bush Sr. You're all very welcome to Roundtable. Victoria, to you, first of all, you were in the room. Just set the scene for us. What was the atmosphere like there?
I think there was a notable difference, obviously, compared to the Friday, compared to the Sunday. I think on the Friday, obviously, there was a huge sense of nervousness. You know, we'd had 12 months since JD Vance's speech last year at Munich, obviously, you know, blew up the room. There was shock, there was silence, there was incomprehension. And I think going into this one, there was a sense of, are we going to hear similar comments? There was a hope that no, that wouldn't be the case. And then obviously afterwards, there was some relief. But then as people more and more digested the situation, they came to the conclusion that, oh, actually, the words were kind of the same in the end. It was just sort of the tone that was different. So I think that was interesting, how it developed over the course of the weekend.
Natia, would you agree that the overriding sentiment was one of relief?
Yes, absolutely. I think last year, when JD Vance gave his speech, it really sent the shockwaves into the main hall, and lots of leaders were much more concerned next day about the future of the transatlantic relationship. And of course, this year, there was this overwhelming tension about what to expect from Marco Rubio. And his tone was soft. He was much more friendly, but I would very much agree with Victoria because overall, I think the message is the same, that Europe needs to spend much more on its defense and security. And ultimately, I think Americans see Europeans as the guarantor of Ukraine's security in the future.
Thank you. So, Oliver, still cracks in the relationship, and this was basically a lick of new paint trying to paper over those cracks.
Well, it certainly is a lick of new paint, yes. But I mean, it's the underlying fundamentals have changed. I mean, we lived in a framework after 45 for many years. Then we had 89, the end of history, etc., etc. But Europe has to do its homework. Europe has to take care of its own security, and it has to kind of grow up. It has to get mature. So no matter whomever speaks, Europe needs to develop more maturity in its relationship towards the US, and I think both sides see that.
And Oliver, what does that maturity look like for you? I mean, is this simply a shorthand phrase for buying more weapons?
Well, certainly it's about buying more weapons, and I think Munich was very much about buying weapons, as it was a big forum for the weapons trade, and I think that was more than ever before. I was the last days in Munich as well. So that's certainly the case, but it's also about understanding that, you know, if you look particularly at Germany, it has outsourced its security to the US since 45. And that was kind of easy too, because they were just taking care of it. And now Germany has to redefine its role in Europe and has to take sides, has to move forward. And that is something which is, it's called in Germany, the Zeitenwende, the change of times. But that's something which is very much at the forefront and was very much key in Munich, I believe.
Steve, give us your take on what's gone on then. Where is the transatlantic relationship going from here?
Yeah, I think the difference in tenor and tone from JD Vance's speech a year ago and Marco Rubio's this year. JD Vance was like being called into the principal's office, something I know you never experienced, Enda, but it was a rather harsh admonishment. This time it was more like a intervention, and you had Marco Rubio there with some tough talk, some clear talk, basically giving Europe the idea of you have to fix your problems, and not just militarily, but internally, domestically, and culturally. And it was tough to hear. But I think, again, the tone was, we want you to succeed. And again, a little bit less harsh and brutal than what we heard from JD Vance a year ago.
And Steve, given what you know of this administration, do you think that was a deliberate tactic for Rubio to tone down the language? There wasn't any of the aggression we saw a year ago from Vance?
Yeah, I think that, President Trump, the Trump administration, and certainly the United States want to continue to have strong relationships with our European allies. As President Trump often says, he is friends with many of these leaders. At the same time, I think President Trump is a guy who looks at polls. And when he looks at Starmer's poll numbers internally, Merz, and the rise of the more conservative groups there, when he looks at the leaders that are succeeding economically and politically in Europe, whether it's Meloni in Italy or others, he's looking at poll numbers and saying that some of these guys are not going to be there or in power with their political parties in another year. So he's almost moving past them and looking ahead to a better future with a new set of leaders when that comes.
Thanks, Steve. Victoria, it was very interesting. Rubio's speech hardly mentioned Ukraine. I mean, the biggest issue on the continent and the worst war since World War II in Europe barely got a look in.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people were quite shocked by that. They expected as well more comments when it came to China, when it came to Russia. I think ultimately, Marco Rubio, it was expected that he was going to be much softer than JD Vance was last year. He's known to very much value the transatlantic relationship. But the people that I spoke to, and these led from former presidents and prime ministers to foreign ministers, defense ministers, they said ultimately it was that Europe wasn't shocked this year. Last year, Europe wasn't prepared. It hit them like a ton of bricks, the speech from JD Vance, whereas this year, Marco Rubio, they were very much more prepared and they knew what was coming for them. They have been preparing so far. But I think it was framed more, and this is one point which really struck people, a fight of civilizations. He talked a lot about migration, about mass migration being a crisis, destabilizing societies. And he very much framed it there as we are defending our values on the continent. So Whereas people perhaps wanted to see more of that rhetoric on Ukraine, on how are we going to counter the threat from Russia, the threat from China. Instead, he sort of framed it, much as JD Vance did last year, the biggest threat is from within Europe at the moment. It is a threat to values, it is a threat to our culture, to our language, to our religion. And this is what the big fight is against. And that was why, even though there was relief in the room, there was also a question, what are we actually fighting here? What is the big picture here? You know, and I think as people digest it, as I said, there are more and more questions going forward. And ultimately, you know, there is perhaps more reassurance now, but there are still questions. Where is the US-European relationship going forward in the future? Is the US still going to be there? And many people say there is still that uncertainty and that unpredictability.
Natia, to you, in terms of Ukraine, what can we read then from the ashes of Rubio's speech?
I would very much agree with Victoria. There was no mention of Ukraine, which was quite striking in Rubio's speech. He mentioned the word civilization 12 times in his speech. There was a question afterwards asked by Ambassador Ischinger, and then I listened to his interview where he spoke a little bit more about Ukraine and the way he sees that the diplomatic track can still be the solution out of this conflict. He referred to the fact that there has been a progress made and there are still some issues left. But I think ultimately the most important issue is that the one that can spoil the entire diplomatic track, which is the issue of territorial settlement, which is a red line for both sides, Ukraine and Russia. And the problem is that we don't really see to what extent US is even considering putting pressure on Russia to soften their rhetoric and to accept any concessions. And so far, Russians are still pushing for their maximalist goals in this case, which is ceding the Donbas region and taking this territory fully. And on that part, I think the Ukrainian standing remains the same. President Zelensky was very clear about the commitment, Ukrainian commitment to peace.
Oliver, to you, just tell me, how concerned do you think the Ukrainians will have been listening to Rubio? And we just heard Natia make an excellent observation. The phrase civilization got mentioned 12 times and Ukraine barely got mentioned.
Well, I think that a lot of Ukrainians, and I spoke to a number of them, as many Europeans, were very much looking forward to Rubio's speech. And it was, in my view, also in Brussels really perceived as a speech of reconnecting with Europe, but with kind of almost a cultural story. Like, if you join our movement, if you join our way of doing things, Europeans, because we are your children and we have common tradition, a common heritage, a common kind of really project. If you join our, let's say, like MAGA project with the US, then you're very much welcome, because I think the main concern of Ukrainians is that there will be no support at all. And this speech was not indicating that. It was rather referring to kind of, well, we know better how to solve conflicts than the international framework as we had it. Trump solved many conflicts, the United Nations wasn't able to, and he was also clearly indirectly referring to Ukraine here. Now, if analysts say that's right or wrong, that was the message they were sending. And I think that was also the way how it was perceived by the many Ukrainians being in Munich, many Ukrainian military in Munich, many military projects and deals being signed there between Americans and Munich.
Steve, we know your president has midterms coming and foreign policy and international relations do not win domestic votes. What's the American thinking now about where Ukraine is going?
You know, it is not on the top 10 of Americans' minds as we head into the midterm elections. If you were going to kind of rate what people are thinking about, it's as James Carville said back during the Clinton years, it's the economy, stupid. And I think President Trump is seeing major gains, whether it's the stock market hitting record highs, gas prices coming to half of where they were under President Biden, grocery prices have come down. The economic growth that we're seeing in the U.S. As a result of the Trump policies are what they're going to continue to communicate as things get better and improve, as interest rates come down. I think they're going to try to make the economy the primary issue. And as we've talked before, the default setting for the United States has always been isolationism. And I think that the danger is that we return to that default setting and that U.S. sort of withdraws from the world, which is dangerous to the world and not really great for the United States as well. So I think as people go into the voting booths in the middle of this year in primaries and then in November, they're going to be thinking about the price of groceries and gas and violence in our streets and the illegal immigration and the cost of the fraud, waste, and abuse in our system that's being revealed. That's what they're going to be thinking about when they go to the polls, not thinking as much about Ukraine or really even about the rest of the world. It's going to be pocketbook issues and what have you done for me lately here at home? I think the danger for President Trump is every time he's getting involved in the international affairs, it looks like he's trying to get a Nobel Peace Prize, and Americans want to make sure they get their piece of the pie. And I think they've got to be very careful with their focus on international issues.
Thank you, Steve. Victoria, I want to talk about where Rubio went to after Munich. I thought it was very, very interesting. He headed immediately to Hungary and then Slovakia. So give us your thoughts on what's the thinking there.
I think that from the outside, when you ask people in Munich, they say, well, you know, presidents, prime ministers, they always make diplomatic trips. You know, there's nothing out of the ordinary with this. When you read into it, these are two countries which have been extremely confrontational, antagonistic towards the European project. They are countries who have repeatedly blocked aid to Ukraine, for example. They are closely aligned with Donald Trump and also with Vladimir Putin. I mean, we saw Robert Fico. He was the only Western European leader who went to the Victory Day parade in Russia, in Moscow, and he drew extreme condemnation for that visit. And, you know, Hungary and Slovakia have both said aid to Ukraine is money for war. And that's something that we don't agree with. We want negotiations instead. They've both got elections coming up. Hungary's Viktor Orban is very much behind in the polls at the moment. And Slovakia as well has got elections coming up. And ultimately, you know, I think reading between the lines, there will be questions as to why he's chosen these two countries at this particular time. And, you know, they will say it's about, you know, energy dependency, it's about trade deals, et cetera, et cetera. But I think many people will be reading between those lines, especially given that these are the two countries who are very much pitting themselves against Europe on many of the key issues which are defining the European Union at the moment.
Oliver, to you, this will not have gone unnoticed in Brussels, the two capital cities that Rubio chose to go to. He could have gone to Paris, he could have gone to London, he could have gone anywhere, but he chose to go to Hungary and Slovakia. What was your impression of those trips?
Well, I think people are reading really much too many things into this because it's the typical Trump, I like your personal index appreciation of situations. These two leaders, particularly Viktor Orban, went to Trump before it was clear that he would ever become president of the United States. I like you, I'm going to support you. So unless the matrix of importance or geopolitical importance or whatever kind of economic relevance, he has this kind of movement of the winning for his new cause. And these two people signed up very early to it and told him and visited him, etc., etc. So I think that's just why Rubio had to go there. And that is very much the personal way in which Trump seems to organize stuff at home and in the US also, I believe, and in Europe.
Steve, some of the commentary in Europe these past few days has been about the lack of trust in the relationship now, transatlantic. Do you feel the trust is gone? Do you trust Europeans? Do they trust you?
I don't think the trust is gone, but I think, like he was just saying, politics is personal to Donald Trump. There's an old saying, all politics is local. With Donald Trump, all politics is personal. And remember, you had Keir Starmer and his Labour government literally working against Donald Trump's election. That's left a mark as far as Donald Trump is concerned. And yet he's still paid a couple of visits to England in the last year that he's been in office. So I think he still resides hard on the personal connections. And the world leaders around the world who recognize that personal connection with Trump will trump policy, no pun intended, will outdo, you know, any friction on various political or economic or military issues. You know, you have to deal with Trump personally, and the wise leaders are doing that, and that's what Orban and others have done. Maloney does it very well. And when you look at South and Central America, President Trump is turning more of the U.S. attention, not necessarily away from Europe, but focusing more on South and Central America with some great success at this point. Some are calling it the Don Roe Doctrine instead of the Monroe Doctrine. But I think that his attention there doesn't mean he's abandoning Europe, but that he's keeping his focus closer to home.
Thanks, Steve. So, Victoria, where does this relationship go from here now? Munich is done and dusted, and a lot of European countries are spending a lot more on defence.
Yeah, I think, as both Steve and Oliver said, at the end of the day, many of them went away from this conference and they said, we don't see eye to eye, but ultimately this is a relationship which has endured for many, many years. It's going to continue enduring for many, many years. And we just have to get on with it. I mean, Kaja Kallas was quite firm in her rebuke to Marco Rubio, but she also said, OK, we don't see eye to eye, but we have to continue working together in the future. And I think that's going to be the takeaway. But then again, European countries have known for some time they need to become more independent, and be that on tech or digital or energy or the economy, and that is where they are moving towards. And, as Ursula von der Leyen, the Commission President, said, we are delivering. We've heard the message that you've given us. We're increasing our NATO defence spending. We are trying to make our economies more competitive. We are diversifying. We are, working together with Ukraine on weapons and everything like this. But we need time to do it. And ultimately, many people who I spoke to said there is a realisation that it takes time. It cannot happen straight away. They need each other. And Friedrich Merz, the German Chancellor, said as well, and he was quite clear, Washington needs Brussels as much as Brussels needs Washington. He said the role of the US as a leader is in question, possibly being questioned, possibly no longer, it's no longer in one of those top spots. And so going forward, this is an alliance which is mutually beneficial.
Tia, it was no coincidence then that Keir Starmer, no sooner had he got back to London, stories started emanating in the UK media that Britain will now rapidly increase spending on defence and get to 3% of GDP possibly this year.
Yes, indeed. I think that was the takeaway in Munich as well, that Europeans need to get their act together because they cannot rely on transatlantic relationship the way they used to. That, of course, doesn't mean that this relationship is cracking down. It's no longer a relationship between the partners. And I think Europeans will try their best to keep this relationship as stable as possible within the frameworks of the Trump administration. But I think one positive angle that we can stress on is that there is a sense of realization from the UK side as well as among the EU member states that it is important to spend more on defence. It is important to increase the spending on all dimensions of security and defense, because this will remain one of the key challenges for Europeans, because I think Russia is not going anywhere. Whether there will be a deal or not, Russia will remain aggressive towards Europe, and this is something that Europe will be ultimately dealing with its own resources.
Thank you. Oliver, just come in on how much money various different European countries are spending on defence. Germany, Poland, even the United Kingdom now upping its defence spend. Clearly, the message from America has landed.
Yes, it absolutely has. And I think that Europeans have understood that the future can be to be a satellite of the US, but only as a strong and robust partner, Europe will have its own independent future together with the Atlantic relationship. I think that is also the message which is really there. And it goes beyond the Trump administration, because it was already Obama saying that Europe should spend more on defense, but the Europeans didn't want to hear it. Biden administration came with the Inflation Reduction Act, which was really bad for European industry. So it is a new future, a future together with the US in a transatlantic relationship, but also in a more globalized world where Europe has to find and see its partners in a balanced way. And defense spending is now being felt as a key element of that. Just mind you, a few months still ago, defense spending was being considered as non-sustainable. So in terms of the sustainability criteria Brussels has defined, so investors couldn't really go into defense. That has now been changed, and that also shows the change of tonality and of really direction Europe is at the moment really proactively engaged in.
Thank you, Oliver. Steve, final point to you. If you were to be unkind here, there are only 3 years left of Donald Trump. Do you think European leaders will pump up the spending for the next few years and then go back to the status quo once he leaves? Or has the MAGA movement changed everything in terms of that relationship?
Well, while we've seen some of the countries step up their contributions to NATO and to defense spending, you still have countries, Spain, Portugal, and others, who are still way behind in meeting those percentages. And I think one of the biggest stories that Rubio was sharing was that it is that internal economic and cultural decline of these countries in Western Europe that should be the most alarming thing. I mean, you have Spain that's allowing apparently 500,000 African immigrants to flood in, who can then flood throughout Europe. There are serious economic and internal issues.
Well, they want them to pay. They want them to pay tax, Steve. They want them to pay tax. They want them to be legal and contribute, and they're already living there. So they've made an economic decision, and it's their business.
Many of them are still coming in, though. And again, as we've seen in England, as they continue to flood across the channel, it's costing British taxpayers money and costing money that could be spent on defense. And for those that are thinking we just have to hold on for 3 more years of Donald Trump, you saw JD Vance a year ago, you saw Marco Rubio this year. Those are your likely next presidents in the United States. So don't look too far ahead thinking, well, we just have to survive 3 more years of Donald Trump. Things will get better.
I think the Democrats might argue differently, Steve, but we've loved talking to you. Thank you very much. And to Oliver, Victoria and Natia here in the studio as well. Remember, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Just search for Roundtable TRT World. But for now, from me, Enda Brady, and all the team here, goodbye and thank you for watching.